Good afternoon. It's nice to see they saved the most provocative topic for last. Donald Shoup, who's the godfather of parking studies, sometimes says that thinking about parking takes place in the reptilian cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain said to govern territoriality, aggression, and ritual display. And I think cognitive science has moved on from this concept of the reptilian cortex, but obviously it holds true for parking. We love our parking spaces. We treasure them. We fight for them. We are so parking-brained as a nation that when the President of the United States argued that the G7 conference should be held at his Miami area Doral resort, the first justification he gave was, there's ample parking. So it's great to be here with you today. What I want to talk to you today about is parking and more generally, this idea that people are really attached to it and how we can get around that and build the kinds of places we want to build. In some cities, you get a really nice illustration of this. This is Chicago, or rather illustrations of the way people save parking spaces in Chicago. You may not know this system. Salt Lake City isn't there yet, but in Chicago, where street parking is at a premium, if you shovel out a spot, you put something in that spot to show that you've reserved it. And I've always imagined that the implication of these objects is that you might be beaten over the head with them if you were to take that parking space. Haven't put that to the test personally. But of course, this system exists in other places too, and it's hard to imagine another domain in which the city government is implicitly endorsing an idea of vigilante justice, which is basically what this amounts to. And in Boston, where I live now, when the city tried to limit this practice to 48 hours after the snowfall, they got a city council person who stood up and said, he objected, and he said, it speaks to the principle of what it means to be an American. Like the gold miner and the pioneers, residents have a right to stake their claims. So what I want to submit to you today is that the pursuit of a good parking space has become the primary determinant of this country's architecture, urbanism, and built environment. Now, what do I mean by good? I mean it's convenient to where you're going. I mean it's available the moment you arrive. And of course, I mean it's free. Now, these three things constitute a trilemma, which means that it's difficult to achieve all three things at the same time without effectively destroying the place that you came to park at in the first place. And you can probably imagine which places in your town or city fulfill two of these three requirements. But this expectation that every parking space be convenient, available, and free has really poisoned our ability to manage this resource, a massive resource, as Andrew mentioned, in a more sensible way. It's forced us to adopt heavy-handed parking minimums, which I'll talk about in a moment, but many of you have in your towns and cities. And it's impeded the construction of affordable housing, it's damaged the environment, and it's made it impossible to build walkable neighborhoods. So Governor Cox said this morning that you have a moral imperative to build. And I've seen that a lot of places are trying to confront how to handle this imperative to build while at the same time managing what I think is basically a fear of a parking shortage. That a lot of this NIMBYism is really rooted in two things: concerns about traffic and about parking, much more than in concerns about neighbors or objection to various architectural styles. And so this preoccupation, this fear of a parking shortage, it's often the first objection raised at the prospect of a new business, some new neighbors, and it's freezing our urban geography and forcing development into sprawl at the fringes where it consumes natural land and generates hour-long commutes for everyone who lives out there. This obsession with providing parking has turned our urban vernacular architecture from something that looks like this into something that looks more like that. And it is this larger, often nonviolent fight about parking, rather than a confrontation over a shoveled spot, that I want to address today. And it's a story about getting into trouble and then hopefully getting out of it again. And so this, not some scuffle at Trader Joe's, is I think the real parking fight that we need to confront. So how did we get into this situation? The parking fight is as old as the road itself, but it got a lot more intense, obviously, after the invention of the automobile, and in particular after the invention of automobiles that could be left outside for days at a time. Now, Americans' enthusiasm for this mode of transport was thorough and immediate. In 1920s Muncie, Indiana, one woman spoke for a nation when she said, she said she had bought a car before she installed indoor plumbing. And the reason, she said, was because you can't go to town in a bathtub. And so as we see this mentality begin to affect the urban environment, we see these intense traffic jams take shape, and observers believe the root of the traffic problem is parking. And if you can handle the spillover parking, you can handle the traffic problem. Now, by the end of World War II, everyone is convinced that spillover parking is actually a matter of primary concern for the health of cities and towns across the country. And so in a post-war report on decentralization, or the move of people and businesses out from town centers into highway-adjacent retail and subdivisions, the Urban Land Institute, which is the National Organization of Real Estate Developers, concludes that parking was the most important single problem facing the central business districts of large cities today. Now, you know what the response to this was. Cities chose to focus on increasing the parking supply and lowering its price through subsidy and through mandate in an attempt to match suburban parking standards and establish them in every downtown and every small town. They used urban renewal to create parking lots, they built public garages, and they made a seismic change to American building practices, requiring that every single building have its own personal parking supply. They felt they had to, because the cost of constructing the parking was higher than what the public wanted to pay. And so zoning would have to make up the difference, because entrepreneurs and garage operators never would. And by the way, lest you think that this cartoon represents artistic license, here is an actual photo of Denver before and after, 1940 and 1970, and here's what it looked like on the ground. Of course, many cities still look this way, although Denver has recovered its form somewhat in recent years. Now, you can understand what planners were thinking when they established these rules. These are not the actual parking requirements for Houston, but they're not far off. Houston, by the way, famous for having no zoning, but it looks like every other American city because it has parking requirements. The logic of these requirements is clear, right? You can have the private sector take care of the parking problem. And instead of city tax dollars funding garages, spillover parking on the streets, developers would be forced to build the parking themselves. Nearly every city has a long and complex code that dictates how many parking spots must accompany every single use, from nail salons to nunneries, really. So I wanted to look at Utah City X here. I'm not going to name any names, but this parking code requires one space for every 6 people at a daycare. And the logic there is, and I can only assume, is that if you stack the children up on top of each other and you put them in a trench coat, then they need a parking space. But this is serious business, because it makes it very hard to start a daycare in a home. And it's often a popular home-based business, but if you establish these types of parking requirements, that becomes impossible. Then we have one space for every 100 square feet of bar, because obviously one of our major public policy objectives should be getting as many people to drive to the bar as possible. So we've ensured that that can remain possible. And then we have 4 spaces for every alley in a bowling alley. Now, Robert Putnam, the sociologist, has written a famous book called Bowling Alone about the decline of American community. But clearly that's not a problem in Utah, where you have 4 spaces for every lane in the bowling alley. So on the other hand, you may have trouble getting new bowling alleys built, because that is a lot of land being required for parking. Now, when it comes to requiring space to park, these laws have worked wonders. Promise not to pick on any cities in Utah, so I went to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where you can see that some 30% of the downtown is dedicated to parking lots. That's surface parking and garage parking. It doesn't include parking inside buildings, doesn't include parking at the curb. They made so much parking that few of us ever have to pay to park, few of us ever have to walk very far from a parking spot to where we're going, and few of us have to spend very much time looking for that spot. They created at least 3 spaces for every car, and in some cities far more. Seattle and Los Angeles have 5 spaces for every household. Des Moines, Iowa has 20 per household. The Bay Area, which we all think of as being a densely settled place where it's difficult to park, has enough parking to wrap a curb lane around the earth twice. So really, suburban parking standards pretty much across the board. But there were some unfortunate side effects. Now, I was in a panel earlier today about the type of development that people want in Utah, and I thought it was pretty interesting that when surveyed, most communities in Utah picked something that looked like the sketch on the upper left as the type of thing they wanted to see more of. But unfortunately, because parking both costs a lot of money to build and takes up a lot of space, as you begin to require more parking, you begin to shift the type of structures that get built from the upper left towards the lower right. So the architect Loeb Fellow said form follows function, very famously, but Don Shoup, the parking scholar, says form follows parking requirements. And you see that happening as you escalate these requirements. The structure of the traditional main street with businesses and retail, sometimes offices or even housing above, stacked up next to each other, becomes simply impossible to build. And historic structures also become impossible to use because there's simply too much parking. And I heard one architect describe them, it's as if they're locked up behind a parking padlock. So this is all very much by design, right? Parking is built for the peak moment of demand. It's built for the busiest time of day, and it's not shared between different uses. So we guarantee lots of redundant asphalt. Now, the biggest and most important impact of this right now is the impact of parking on housing, right? Utah, like the rest of the nation, is suffering from a housing affordability crisis. Countless studies have shown that these parking rules force developers to overbuild parking when they build apartments, and it places a huge premium on tenants who don't drive, and it limits our ability to produce other housing types like affordable housing, senior housing, housing for the homeless, and generally speaking, multifamily infill development, where, as I mentioned, because of the cost and the amount of space required, it's very difficult. And so this whole missing middle housing that you see here on the left, that once made up the backbone of most American cities, has been made obsolete, or made impossible to build, I should say, by these requirements. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with living in a 13-story building with the first 5 stories being garage, as you see on the right there, or, of course, in a detached single-family home, which most Americans choose. But we've really taken this middle option off the menu, and I think that's a shame, and it impedes our ability to create diverse housing types, to create diverse neighborhoods where different type of people can live, going beyond the typical nuclear family. And we've made those impossible to build mostly because of parking requirements. So to take it back, for example, to City X in Utah, there's a minimum of 4 spaces required for a 4-bedroom apartment. And you can see how, if you're a developer, that's really going to discourage you from building 4-bedroom apartments because that's a lot of parking to provide, costs a lot of money, takes up a lot of space, and it changes the types of units that get put onto the market. Obviously, this has a negative effect on the environment with a capital E. There's the carbon emissions from the driving, the local pollution, stormwater flooding, lack of groundwater replenishment for aquifers, and finally, the urban heat island effect. And then there's also the asphalt and the concrete that goes into building all this asphalt. And then more importantly, perhaps, for local politics in the places that you all come from, this parking creates a lot of traffic. First, because it functions as a big hidden subsidy for driving, but also because it lowers urban density and design to the point where alternatives to driving become impossible. On a societal level, parking is a dish that only makes us hungry for more parking. As one city official put it to me, if your number one concern is traffic and your number one request is parking, you have to understand that those two things are at cross purposes. And we have examples of this phenomenon where more parking encourages higher rates of car ownership and more driving at every level, from homes to cities to offices. But I want to focus on offices because the examples there are particularly strong. And there's one from my neck of the woods, which is, this comes from, MIT. And MIT did something really interesting where they started charging for parking differently. They used to charge by the month, and they started to charge by the day. And what happened was the share of people driving alone to work fell by 8%, just because the way the fee was assessed had changed. It didn't actually cost any more to drive. It's just that parking was no longer a sunk cost. People were making those decisions on a day-by-day basis, and they were actually putting money in their own pocket when they decided to carpool, ride a bike, work from home, etc. And one of the results of this for MIT was they were able to cut a 400-space garage out of their portfolio. It was an aging garage, and they didn't have to replace it. And by the way, there's evidence of this from much more sprawling cities than Boston. The FHA has tested a policy like this on a model for Houston, and they found a similar drive-alone share drop of 8% for the VMT. And it's higher in cities like Los Angeles and Denver. So a lot of potential to change people's behavior. What we're getting to here is this idea that parking demand is elastic. It's not as fixed as these ratios would imply. And by the way, oh yeah, so this is I got a little, this is an artist representation of me talking to you here, which I had them sketch up for this event. This is a big deal, and what we know is that the demand is elastic, we have more parking than we need, and we know that there's evidence of negative externalities associated with all this extra parking. And all that has led to the parking reform movement, right? And this has really taken off in the last couple years, this movement to adjust parking's place in the urban environment and take it down a notch on our hierarchy of needs. Now you all, this is a representation of you here in the room, you hold this sort of potion in your hands, which is parking policy. It's really powerful, and you have 4 ways, I think, that you could use it for good, which are pretty simple, really. The first one is count the parking that you have. The second is build less parking. The third is to share the parking. And then finally, if need arises, to charge for the parking. Now let's start with counting. It seems so obvious, but for decades, this was not really part of the parking game. One parking industry person told me that commercial parking was like this. Imagine you were the executive of a one-fleet airline, and I asked how many people were on the airline. I don't know. Is Joey on the plane? I don't know. Did Joey buy a ticket? I don't know. That's parking, right? For a long, long time, both at the commercial level and at the city level. Very few estimates. Now, of course, that's changing. We're getting cities that are actually doing pretty reliable counts of how much parking they have and whether it's available. And this allows us to reassess the value of what we have and decide to do different things with it, right? Because this curb space can be tremendously valuable if it can be put to other uses. And we're thinking about things like space for deliveries, food trucks, ADA parking, bike lanes, pedestrian safety improvements, green space. All of these things are becoming possible as cities decide actually maybe they do have enough parking. And that starts with counting. But the next step, of course, is building less. Because once you've counted and you've realized you have enough parking, you can begin to change the laws. And that's what all these cities, these red dots are doing, is they're building less parking. Seattle experimented with a pilot policy allowing developers to decide how much parking to build. Over 5 years, developers built 17,000 fewer spaces than what would have been required. Now that's a savings of $500 million in parking, foregone parking in one city over 5 years, which just gives you a sense of how much money is getting spent on all this stuff. Now, when California stopped requiring accessory dwelling units to include their own parking spaces, they saw tens of thousands of garages converted into granny flats and backyard cottages for seniors and singles. And ADUs now make up 1 in 4 new units in the city of Los Angeles every year. So these diverse housing types, which permit diverse neighborhoods, are not possible with parking requirements. Where do they park? Well, they park out on the street, of course, which in many neighborhoods is an underused resource. And I know people feel a little uncomfortable with that, but I think in a growing city, it's time to get over that. The street is a really valuable resource that can be used, and probably more important, it's probably more important to be able to provide housing for people. Minneapolis, similar results. They've gotten rid of parking mandates. They're getting a bunch of new infill building in return. And one of the bonuses for them is that because these apartments don't have their own parking spaces, they often rent at lower rates compared to the market. So it is kind of a shortcut to affordable housing to take this amenity out of the equation. And there's even projects in, this is Tempe, Arizona, which has no parking at all. And I think that's the first time that housing without parking has been built in the Phoenix area in decades. So the place this is having the biggest impact is in mixed-use development, which brings me to the third parking reform lever that you can use, which is sharing, right? In Buffalo, who's building developments with less parking? It's mixed-use developers. And you can't probably read this chart from where you are, but I'll just tell you, it shows that this reform is really taking off with them, and that's because the parking can be shared, right, between the commercial uses that use it during the day and the residential uses that require it at night. So now you can be innovative about where the parking goes. LA, another reform they did was to allow historic structures to build without including parking, and they saw a huge boom in adaptive reuse. More than 6,000 apartments created downtown in these old and previously vacant commercial buildings, more apartments in downtown LA than in the previous 30 years. Now, where did they park? They parked in downtown's many extant commercial garages, which tended to be mostly empty at night. So that's a symbiotic relationship we can keep in mind as we begin to reform these policies. Now, one reason, obviously, that parking has such a powerful effect is that it's not shared. It's balkanized between homes, offices, shops, and that means clients must drive from one business to the next, and complementary parking uses like an office and an apartment building or a church and a school exist side by side, one empty while the other is full, and vice versa. And the fact that all this parking isn't shared helps explain why there can simultaneously be so much parking, and it can also be hard to park, right? Water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. But the good news is that shared parking is taking off, including here in Utah. I've heard of several examples just today of jurisdictions that have decided they can share the parking and thereby allow builders to build less of it. And that's good news for the environment, for affordable housing, for walkable neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. Now, I've heard of an office developer, David Cunningham. He's at Granite Properties. They build stuff out primarily in very car-dependent Sunbelt locations. And he actually counted all his parking, and he realized that he was overbuilding this parking to the tune of 10,000 empty spaces across the firm's portfolio, which meant that the firm had spent $100 million minimum building all this parking, and that was just the empty spaces, not even the full ones. So he started to share these spaces between his different tenants and thereby allow himself to build buildings at a lower price point with less parking, all because of sharing, right? So here's a place that does a good job with all of these parking policy elements. This is Seaside, Florida. It's the flagship town of new urbanism. And they do a pretty good job with some of their design elements, like here's a parking space in Seaside, pretty elegant, not so much of an eyesore. But they did do one big mistake in Seaside. For a long time, all their public parking was free, and their town square was essentially a giant parking lot. So this is a critique often leveled at new urbanists. This meant that people would circle around looking for a parking spot, creating traffic jams, and it sort of ruined the charm or the potential charm of this central space. But during COVID, they took the cars out and they decided they liked it as a bona fide public plaza. And they wanted to keep it that way afterwards, and they managed to do it. And here's what it looks like now. And the way they were able to do this is deciding that they were going to charge for the rest of their parking. And they came to this realization that every community that charges for parking comes to, which is that demand for parking is elastic. And some families that had previously come in 3 separate cars now came in 1 because it costs money to park. And by the way, one of the side benefits of this was that parking along the curb on the state road that runs through Seaside became normalized. And don't tell the UDOT folks this, but this had the additional benefit of slowing down traffic, which made the street safer for everybody who was crossing between the village and the beach. To some extent, this idea that people will not walk from a parking space to the place they're going is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If your urbanism is lousy with parking, it will not be a nice place to walk. People like to walk in places like Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Society Hill in Philly, or Seaside because they're great places. And in fact, they go there precisely to walk around. So walking from a parking space is no big deal. And in fact, if you do these things, you can change the way people get around. I swore I wouldn't mention Boulder because I know nobody thinks Boulder is an adequate point of comparison for Utah cities. But let's face it, 20 years ago, 66% of people in Boulder were driving alone to work. That has now fallen to 34%, and it's because they've enacted a lot of these smart reforms. It's a cold weather city, but lots of people bike even through the winter months, which is pretty cool. And then I wanted to also spotlight Austin, Texas, because this is another super car-dependent place, really fast-growing, and they just abolished their parking minimums. And how they did it, this is a screenshot from a website that was set up to support this campaign, and they basically promised 3 things. First, they said parking reform is a little under the radar. People weren't really paying attention to this so much. They said they also made relatively small promises, which is true, despite what I've told you. It's unlikely to change the face of your city overnight to get rid of these rules. And then finally, they just forced people to ask themselves, is parking really more important to you than creating affordable housing? Is it really more important than creating a walkable neighborhood, than creating housing for people to age in place and so on? And ultimately, they got those minimums repealed, and we're going to see what happens with that. So you may be saying, okay, this is all well and good, but here in Utah, things are different. Everybody needs a car to get around. And I don't dispute that. I don't dispute that you need a car to live life to the fullest. I think the question you should ask yourself is, how many parking spaces does that car need? That's the question. The cool thing about Utah is that you guys have begun to make these investments in making life with fewer cars possible. So I'm talking about, well, first of all, let's look at, these are some images from the Parking Modernization Guidebook. And this is Ogden and South Salt Lake. And just look at that, those light blue bars on the image on the upper left. That's available spaces in Ogden, which shows you about 50% of their parking supply is never being used. So that's a massive resource for them to build on. If they wanted, for example, to share parking, build new buildings without parking, and so on. And in fact, this reform is happening. I mean, just today, I've heard about how Salt Lake City enacted its own parking reform. It's now possible in certain neighborhoods in Salt Lake City, represented here by, I think, mostly the red, but also some of the green and blue, to build things without including parking. And the results of that have been really positive. There's all kinds of buildings that are getting built that don't conform, that wouldn't have been possible under the old rules. And you can ask Nick from Salt Lake City for details about that. I've also heard about Clearfield's new downtown development, creating a parking problem, and then people adapting to accommodate. And I've heard about Vineyard, which is, and Daybreak also, right? Two more communities that are also trying to deal with these issues in creative ways. So it's happening all around you. You don't even need to look to Colorado or Los Angeles or anything like that. Obviously, the elephant in the room here is the housing crisis. I'm sure you've seen this graph showing this is Salt Lake City metro area home prices. Sorry if this is giving you PTSD. But yeah, it's not good if you're buying. But what it means is there's an urgency to these land use questions. And I think the governor drove that home this morning. And if I can't appeal to your idealism in changing the parking rules, I'll appeal to your conservatism and say, you might lose the ability to act on this. Because that is what has happened in Colorado. That's what's been recommended to the governor in Montana, is that the state preempt localities on being able to make decisions about parking. And the governor here this morning said the pressure will continue to ratchet up. So I think this is an opportunity to get this right now and make these changes. And then the other thing I would say is that there's an element of future proofing here, right? Because we're seeing a once in a century, really, change in the way that people drive in this country. And I'm not even going to talk for the moment about e-bikes or any of the other exciting trends in transportation, but just to say cars are changing. Parking spaces are now going to be also sources of power for electric vehicles. And this means adapting all the parking stock to accommodate for electric vehicles. And that's a very expensive adaptation if we continue to overbuild parking at the rate we've been doing it for 100 years. So it's all the more reason to get this right now and to find a way to share this resource. So as we invest in these electric vehicle chargers, we can find a way to make one charger work for two vehicles, for example. And then, of course, there's the prospect of autonomous vehicles. I'm sure you've all seen photos or videos of these vehicles driving around Phoenix and San Francisco. They have the potential to basically change the entire parking paradigm as we know it and make obsolete all this parking that we've required in central locations, because many people would simply be dropped off by a robot-driven car that wouldn't need to park at all, or could park on the low-density fringe, or might simply just drive around and pick up another customer. So all of this is more reason not to overbuild all this parking right now. Now, the promise of all this, right, is not to punish drivers. It's not for a massive movement of car-free households. It's for the freedom to leave the car behind once in a while. And there's a surprising amount of promise here. The median American household owns 2.2 cars. It's a lot of cars. But more than half of all trips in U.S. cities are under 3 miles. So it's a distance that could be comfortably made on an electric bike, on a regular bike, on foot, if the infrastructure made it possible. And part of this involves rethinking the role of parking in our streets and in our buildings, because that's what creates such a hostile environment for pedestrians and bikers. Sometimes it's about literally taking this real estate and using it to make these streets safer for people, as you see daylighting, for example, around intersections or protect bike lanes and so on. But it's also about increasing the density and allowing more things to crop up within walking distance of the places people live. If we were to take the parking supply that we have just here in downtown Salt Lake City and use it to do something else with it, there would be so many more things within walking distance of this very convention center. Schools, cafes, gyms, parks, stores, you name it. All of this stuff could arise on the land that you here in Utah have land banked for this purpose. So that's very exciting. And then you will reach a kind of density tipping point, at which point, it feels like the neighborhood's gotten crowded, lots and lots of people are parking on the street in front of their buildings, and at that point, the density of the neighborhood reaches this magic moment where suddenly there's enough people living there that they can support these local amenities within walking distance. And so it's this magic moment where right as the streets become so crowded that it seems like you're going to reach a breaking point, suddenly it becomes possible to walk to the cafe, to the grocery store, to the gym, and so on. Because cars, I think, represent freedom, right? I don't think we have any doubt about the role that the car plays in the American imagination. But the inability to get around any other way, I think, represents a kind of prison. So parking subsidy is nice, but car dependency, being forced to buy a car to participate in life, is a kind of tax. And it forces Americans to put a rising share of their incomes into purchasing, fueling, maintaining, and insuring 2.2 automobiles per household. It's a lot of money. If you continue to build all this parking in all these developments, you will ensure that families buy 3-4 cars. You will force them to commute long distances. You will create lots of traffic as those commutes take shape. And you will condemn them to neighborhoods where something so simple as walking to buy milk is not possible. But if you begin to enact some of these changes, a virtuous cycle can begin. And your kids will look back in 20 years when this state's population is twice what it is today, and they will praise your foresight. Because I think, and this is one thing that I've come across in the trips that I've made to talk to city council members about this subject, New Mexico, Colorado, Minnesota, Florida, Texas, and the thing I hear over and over again is that there is a fear of a parking shortage, and it is holding people back. And so I think you confront a kind of trolley problem, where the status quo, we can all admit, is not great. And the status quo looks like super expensive houses being built in pretty car-dependent locations, lots and lots of concrete waste, super long commutes, more traffic, and more parking. And it's possible to change that, right? It's possible to take the other track. And the other track looks like more walkable neighborhoods, more affordable housing, more options for seniors to age in place, more options for kids to move out of their parents' houses, but it requires managing parking and thinking creatively about that. So that's what I challenge you to take away from this, is to go back to your communities and try it. And the great thing about parking policy is it's flexible. And if you get it wrong and you charge for meters on Main Street and nobody wants to pay for them, well, you know what? You can lower the price. It's really, I think, that's one of the reasons I think this reform movement is taking off, because unlike, say, different mega-scale planning like building a new transit line, these are adjustments that can be made overnight. So I think that's very exciting. Now, without parking distorting our streets and our architecture, I think a lot of change is possible. How many more people could live in walkable places? How many seniors could age in place? And how many young adults could finally move out of their parents' houses? And I know you would all appreciate that. So how many car-dependent places freed from parking laws could grow into the kinds of places where we could walk? Do something so simple as walk. And where a family with 3 cars could get by with 2, and a family with 2 cars could get by with 1. I think it's possible. In that world, it might be a little harder to find a parking spot, but it would be so much easier to live in a place where you would not need to drive so often, where kids could walk to school and adults to the grocery store, because in a world with better parking, there would be fewer places to park, yes, but in places of those old parking spaces would emerge a city so much richer and fuller and fairer that you would not think twice about what had been lost. Thank you very much.